So it's recording. So first of all, I want to thank you again for joining us today and to present you Professor Mojtaba Mahdavi. You are currently a professor at the University of Alberta. Your field of study explores mainly Middle Eastern studies, political economy, contemporary Islamic studies, decolonial and postcolonial studies, discursive and intellectual transformations in the MENA and Muslim context. And today I want to focus in my questions mainly on the chapter you wrote, Rethinking China, the Middle East and Asia in a Multiplex World, and the co-edited book, The Triple Pillar of Sino-MENA Relations in the Age of Neoliberalism. And I'll let you first introduce your book.
Thank you very much, Sasha. It's great to be here, and thank you for inviting me. Yes, as you mentioned, I co-edited a book a few months ago. It came out with Brill Publisher on China and Middle East relation because I thought both China and Middle East and North Africa, MENA, are really important in this changing dynamics of global order or disorder. And I also wrote an independent, of course, different chapter in this book. So basically, the whole idea was to rethink and critically problematize a complex, multi-dimensional and genus-based relationship between China and Middle East and Asia in particular, in a multiplex world, to use a phrase coined by Acharya, as well as a neoliberal context. So this is a word which has already moved towards decentering of power, authority, and value system, which does not necessarily mean a world with greater justice or more progressive values, but certainly a multiplex world. The key question for me in this book, and in particular in my own chapter, was basically to what extent China-MENA-Asia relations is important, and what do China-MENA relations look like in this multiplex and yet neoliberal world. More specifically, I examined 3 pillars of Sino-MENA relations and how MENA civil society basically can benefit from this relationship. That's the basically main and cardinal question. First, we need to understand China, a real China beyond 2 extremes of xenophilia and xenophobia, if you wish, which exists in the literature, in public discourse. On the one hand, China and the idea of new Confucianism are presented as an alternative and remedy our moral, economic, and political decay. This is the Daniel Bell argument and a few others. On the other hand, China and Confucianism are presented as an inferior, dangerous, and a major threat to peace and prosperity. This is the typical of Samuel Huntington clash of civilization and other arguments. So I think the fact is today's China, the real China is neither of the two above. The real China is something between these 2 poles. And I would suggest that in my book and in this book and my chapter, pragmatism is a key word to understand today's China. So China's reformist leader, as we know, Deng Xiaoping, once famously argued, it doesn't matter if a cat is black or white, as long as it catches mice, it's a good cat. So I call this cat theory, and I argue that basically this cat theory explains both China's domestic economic developmental policy, in which development should be achieved either by plan or market economy, and also in Chinese foreign policy, including Sino-MENA relationships. So that's what I mean by pragmatism. So more specifically, what are the 3 pillars of China-MENA relations? The first pillar basically focused on energy, trade, investment, arms deal, security, geostrategic significance, and things like that. The second pillar of this relationship basically focuses on China's policy of non-intervention and respecting MENA sovereignty and being pro-status quo. The third pillar is about something which we can call it the Chinese model of development, which I'll elaborate on this briefly, what exactly mean and why this is important in this context. So briefly, let's talk about the first pillar, and that's China's strategy of peaceful rise, and in response to its rapid economic growth, China basically needed more energy. And as simple as this. So MENA societies became an obvious choice for oil and gas resources. More than 40% and oil and more than 30% gas comes from this region, if not more at this point. Also, a strong Sino-MENA relations would serve Beijing's security concern about Muslims Uyghur in Xinjiang region. It prevents MENA states' support for Muslim Uyghur, which we know that they are actually suppressed by Chinese government. So China wanted actually to secure its security in a way. So related to this is also China's comprehensive strategic partnership with MENA states, which serves both trade and investment and security concerns of both states, MENA states and China state. So in a way, MENA's strategic and geopolitical location connecting Europe, Central Asia is also important for China's trade, investment, and all of these things related to the first pillar. So while the MENA energy is the main driving force for China's pragmatism and pragmatist policy with all, and that's why actually you see China is have good relation with all competing states in this region easily. So in this region, MENA states, on the other hand, could benefit from this relationship, especially with respect to BRI, which is basically China's foreign policy these days, Belt and Road Initiative, which is President Xi Jinping signature foreign policy, and very, very important in this context. Alternative financial institutions available to some of the MENA states, so they can actually use from China's alternative financial institutions such as Asian Infrastructure Invest Bank. They can benefit from Chinese, I guess, achievement in terms of renewable energy and things like that. So I mean, the point is, in this context, both can benefit from each other to some extent. The second pillar, briefly, is protecting political status quo and stability, obviously in the service of more trade and business for China. And this is also pragmatism. And there are examples of this. China abstained in United Nations Security Council with respect to the case of Libya 2011, when Europe and NATO actually invaded Libya. But at the same time, China continued sending arms to Saudi Arabia, despite that Saudis are committing war crimes in Yemen. Then we know that the same policy in Syria, China supported Syrian regimes because of the stability of the regime and Assad regime. And we know that simply China ignored war crimes committed by Assad regime. So this is what China actually pursuing. At the same time, we know that autocratic MENA states, the governing authority, the rulers, definitely welcome Chinese non-interventionist policy, because China doesn't really include the question of human rights in its foreign policy, right? It simply said this is a domestic and internal issue, and I don't really care about this. Obviously, autocratic MENA states and Asian states, of course, they appreciate that. So again, you see how pragmatism and cat theory is central to this second pillar. The third pillar, briefly, it's about Chinese model of development. And what is this Chinese model of development? We know that there are many ways to understand this, but more specifically, I would say at least there are three interpretations of what is this Chinese model of development. The official policy of China, the official interpretation of Chinese authority of this Chinese model of development is something they call it socialism with Chinese characteristics. And that's a Beijing's version of it. The second interpretation or version of Chinese model of development is something which Joshua Cooper Rommel in his work in 2004 called this Beijing consensus in basically in contrast to the Washington consensus, which says it includes innovation economy, sustainable pro-equality economy, and things like that. It's sort of, I guess, positive view of Chinese model of development. The third interpretation of Chinese model of development is something which David Harvey in 2005 called it neoliberalism with Chinese characteristics. And I personally believe the third interpretation is closer to the reality, what we have in today's China. Chinese model of development, of course, Chinese authority never suggest that this is a universal model. They simply say that this is our own way of economic development. But we can talk about this. What we have in reality is a sino-capitalism, if you wish, with elements of mercantilism, authoritarianism, and planned economy. So this is economic development without democracy, if you wish, right? And here we see that MENA autocratic states definitely welcome this development model because they do not appreciate democracy, and obviously they want to benefit from this economic development. So in a way, it's a new liberal authoritarianism and in general. So to what extent the Chinese vision of the global order differs radically from the existing neoliberal order, and to what extent MENA societies, I would say, can benefit from this Chinese path of development. So I have a few quick observations here. The first one is that Beijing's neoliberal path, like other forms of neoliberalism, I think in my view is a structural violence to environment and to the dignity of ordinary people. Moreover, it is, we know that actually the growing military budget of China, the second largest in the world at this point, next to the United States, doesn't really match Beijing's official discourse of peaceful development and peaceful rights. So there are problems here, which we really need to problematize. The second point is that Beijing's treatment of Muslims minority or groups in Xinjiang, which violates their cultural and political rights, doesn't really offer a good model for the MENA and Asian society with multiple cultures, religious diversity, and plural society they have. And they really need a better model of pluralism and respect for difference. So Chinese top-down modernization, forced assimilation, and development without democracy, in some cases, of course, doesn't really offer much to the MENA and Asian society, which need democracy, pluralism, and social justice at the same time. The third point is that Beijing's not quite welcoming policy towards 2019-2020 pro-democracy demonstration in Hong Kong, and its cozy and complex relation with the Myanmar military dictatorship coup in 2021, again, doesn't offer a good lesson to build a more inclusive democratic society in MENA. Finally, Beijing's neoliberal policy produce and intensify social inequality and empower basically capital, not the citizens. And MENA society badly and urgently need a pro-social justice model for development to empower citizens and to consolidate inclusive democracy. So in the absence of social justice, we know that populist demagogues always mobilize the poor and middle class, lower middle class, and basically at the cost of real democracy. And of course, we have to be super, super careful. To conclude, I would say that if the question is how MENA social forces and civil society, and here I would like to say that my focus and approach is civil society approach rather than a state centrism. How MENA civil society and social forces can benefit from Sino-MENA relationship, I have 3 quick points here. The first is China is neither a savior of MENA from neoliberal authoritarian trends, nor is it an evil force. No, none of them. China pursues Deng Xiaoping's pragmatist cat theory in its relation with MENA. So MENA should do the same. And while learn lessons from China, they should actually pursue their own independent policies towards development and democracy. They should figure out their own path. MENA can certainly benefit from Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, knowledge economy, clean energy and investment of China, and many other things which China can actually offer and help. But they should never allow for a new form of dependency and new colonialism with Beijing. The second point is China is neither a decisive counter-hegemonic force, nor yet a world hegemon at this point. China's participation in the MENA, along with other members of BRICS, and non-Western, countries, emerging power, could consolidate a multipolar world and challenge US hegemony and its unilateralism and neoliberal interventionism, especially during President George W. Bush and a few other presidents, Iraq, Libya, Afghanistan, and things like that. So although Chinese support of the status quo benefit autocratic regimes in MENA, we know that, but it protects the MENA society from regime change, war, intervention, which all of them are actually counterproductive to a homegrown democracy. Democracy should come from within, and it really needs peace and it really needs development. War and intervention are quite counterproductive to this. So MENA society need peace and development so they can themselves challenge their own autocratic regime. As you can see during the Arab Spring, as we can see today's Iran, actually you see there's a new movement, social movement, quite grassroots and led by women. So definitely it should come from within, and peace and development are central to this. So they really need to do this. The third and final point is that the Chinese model of development, whether real or perceived, have mixed results for the future of MENA civil society. On the one hand, it has been used by MENA autocratic regimes to consolidate their neoliberal autocracies. That's for sure. But on the other hand, it may actually in part benefit social forces for more development and peace, as I mentioned. MENA societies should develop their own models of development, their own ways of democracy and modernity. And I believe in multiple modernity rather than one single version of modernity, multiple democracies, which guarantees social justice and freedom at the same time. Each society and region is particular and needs its own path to development while learning from others. This is something we can call it a combination of global and local approach. If you wish, we can call it glocal. And this glocal approach benefit from global experience, including China, but based on local tradition, local culture. So this is a synthetic dialectical sort of relationship, and based on this local tradition and characteristics. So from a civil society perspective, neither the Washington consensus of neoliberalism nor the Beijing consensus of another form of liberalism is the solution to MENA, Asia, and in a larger context, I would say global South. They really need to come up with their own model and vision, while of course benefiting from the global experience. So that was perhaps a quick summary of my contribution.
Thank you so much for the summary. It was very complete, very interesting. And yes, for those interested, they should definitely go and read it, which I did. So I have a few questions for you. So first of all, we talked at first about how China's development model gives priority to economic development over political democracy. Should we worry about the consequences this might have globally in a few years if we end up in a Sino-led world? Because you said that China might be a risk for American hegemony.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, that's a good question. First of all, we know that democracy and I would say citizenship, these are actually in big trouble even in so-called developed world and liberal societies these days, including Western societies. You have the rise of Trumpism, ultra-right, Brexit. So it's even in democracies in Asia, such as India, you have the rise of, I guess, right-wing fundamentalism. So democracy is in a challenge and trouble globally. So this is not something in non-Western society. The rise of right-wing populism, of course, and the crisis of liberal order, and the fall of liberal hegemony and neoliberal hegemony. So this is global. With respect to the Chinese case, of course, we know that China, of course, follows its own path, and liberal democracy is not its own model. So we know that over the past 4 decades, they established their own particular model of development, which focuses on development, a plan, mixed plan economy, and of course, their own version of neoliberalism. And they've been successful in their own ways. They also, at this point, are the second largest economy and maybe soon the first, I guess, economy globally. But as I mentioned in my brief talk and also in the actual paper, there are 2 different ways to look at China's rise. One is a very, I would say, not quite realistic way of seeing China based on sort of xenophobia, which is, of course, dominated in some of the media and especially right-wing media to present, I guess, an unrealistic, I guess, feature of China, which is not quite helpful. On the other hand, a very romantic and romanticized vision and picture of China as the solution to the problem of the global economy and global order. As I mentioned, both are probably not quite accurate. And the real China is what we see today. The implication for for Middle Eastern society, Asian society, global South society, I think it would be, yes, there are cases which we can say China tried to exploit the resources of other society. There are definitely cases, and there are arguments what China has done to some Asian countries, Sri Lanka and African societies. But there are, of course, other cases China helped this society in terms of giving loan and, of course, alternative source of energy and things I mentioned in my own chapter. So I would say there should be a balance sort of approach towards China, and society should actually choose their own path and proactively, I guess, deal with China. China is neither angel nor evil. So it's another country emerging the power, definitely regional power, not yet a superpower. And it's part and parcel of this global new liberal order, which benefits from it, but of course, at the same time wants to dominate more, which is obvious in every, I guess, emerging power.
Okay, thank you. And if we look at some countries you cite in your chapter, like Saudi Arabia, Iran, the United Arab Emirates, what can we say about like, can we say that like the main difference between these regimes is mainly based on the role prioritizing Islamic ideals over pragmatism that is played in the Middle East? Like, what do you think about this? Because I think there's definitely more priority given to religion in countries like this. What would you have to say about this?
Yeah, of course, these countries are different, as you mentioned. The type of regime is different and their model of economy is different. United Arab Emirates, particularly, and to some extent, today's Saudi Arabia, are part and parcel of global economy. They really want to work with United States, China, and Europe, and they are part and parcel of this global energy and global economy. They also showed a sense of pragmatism in their own foreign policy, and definitely they would welcome, I guess, consolidating their relation with any power, including China or Russia, which doesn't really care about human rights or things like that. We know that even United States foreign policy is quite controversial, and when it comes to the human rights, there is a double standard, definitely in Western foreign policy. They do care about human rights if the country which violates human rights is against their own interests. But if it's part and parcel of friendly tyrants, they don't really care. We know that. And United States and Europe, we know that there is a double standard. So when it comes to the Asian and Middle Eastern autocrats, obviously they would welcome warmer and a stronger relationship with all powers, including China and Russia, to pursue their own economic development. And definitely, if a power even symbolically doesn't really care about human rights, that's a plus for them. But my point is that there is much more going on in these countries, and that's civil society forces and social actors. We should not simply reduce the complexity of this society into a state, because in many cases, these states do not represent the will of the people. And as you can see, since 2009, at least, the first waves of the social movement until 2009, Iran's Green Movement, 2010, 2011, Arab Spring, 2013, Turkish Gezi Park movement. After that, over the past few years, we had many social movements in this society. They want democracy, they want social justice, they want economic development at the same time. And of course, a state in this society do not necessarily represent their own will. So it's a very complex thing. When it comes to the state, yes, I would say MENA state, Asian state autocrats, they definitely want to have a better relation with all these powers to consolidate their own power. And in some cases, their policy might benefit societies. In some cases, may not, and simply consolidate their own power.
Okay, so we could say that like religion in these countries affect them more internally than globally and externally.
Yeah, I mean, religion in these countries, of course, is different. The case of Iran somehow is different because officially it's an Islamic regime, Islamist regime. But even in case of Iran, you see that they are somehow pragmatists in their own foreign policy, and they do not necessarily follow so-called religious values. Even in domestic policy, the way actually behave and suppress the democratic social movement doesn't necessarily, I guess, represent religious values. It's all about power politics, pragmatism, elites' power. So the role of religion in domestic and foreign policy in these countries are different. And I do not suggest that, and this is a topic for a different presentation, perhaps. We can definitely talk about this. I do not see religion as the main factor which can explain these regimes' domestic and I guess foreign policy. Even if there is a religious discourse and rhetoric, it's their own ideology. It's a politicized version of religion, which became the state ideology and the elite's ideology to consolidate their own power.
Okay, thank you. My other question is that the second pillar of China, as like non-interventionist and its lack of colonialist background in the MENA region makes the Sino-Middle Eastern ties solely economic, we could say. So is there still a place for political consequences that would include a more autocratic influence? And do you think the MENA region would benefit from following China's non-interventionist? I'm thinking here of China's foreign minister, Wang Yi, who talks about the region's chaos as resulting from its geopolitical rivalry. You mentioned this at some point in your chapter too.
I guess China's policy of non-interventionism, at least in MENA, we don't know about what will happen in Asia. I hope that's the case, is basically based on its what I call cat theory, right? Pragmatism, because they need, and they BRI, Belt and Road Initiative, definitely needs peace and stability for greater development, more investment. So that's number one. So they definitely would not like to see war or intervention, because that would challenge their own economic interests, right? And that's why when it comes to even supporting autocrats such as Assad or other dictators, they do this. So it's not based on so-called certain progressive values. It's about pragmatism. This is number one. Number two, we know that autocratic states in MENA, Asia, or everywhere obviously appreciate this non-interventionism and pro-status quo, right? Because they can benefit from this. But the point is, and this is a tricky one, is that when it comes to the civil society interest, I think non-interventionism of Chinese foreign policy is good for MENA, Asia, and global South civil society, because it gives them certain space to develop their own ways of democracy and modernity and development. Because if the alternative is war, intervention, and I guess international and foreign intervention, as we see in case of Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, Iraq, the outcome is not peace, the outcome is not development, the outcome is not democracy. So this is how MENA civil society can benefit it. But we know that, of course, autocratic regimes obviously appreciate this, but we know that the outcome of Western, United States, and European intervention in this society has not been democracy, right? It's been more chaos, more, I guess, extremism, and even this so-called, look at the outcome of this global war on terror. After 2 decades or so, United States actually gave Afghanistan to the same group of the Taliban, right? And look at today's Iraq, look at Libya, is chaotic. Look at Syria, and look at all these cases which have not been actually quite successful. I wrote a piece, I guess almost 10 years ago or so, on the critique of responsibility to protect in the Middle East, R2P, and so-called humanitarian intervention, which despite all the good intention, the outcome has been actually quite catastrophic. And we know that this is not the way we need it in this region. I'm not sure if I answered your question.
No, I think that was good. Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
I have one last question for you. Do we know what's the public opinion of the civil society in these countries when it comes to these relations? What do we have to say about this?
Yes, that's an excellent question, actually. It varies, I would say. Like, for instance, in Iran, China is not popular. The public perception of China is not really positive. And this is mainly due to the regime so-called secretive, I guess, relation with China with respect to some of the contract they have. So China is not quite popular in the public sphere in Iran because the regime is not popular, and that's why, because of good relation between China and the States. So in other cases, it varies. We really need to have an independent, like case-by-case investigation. In some cases, we know that because China helped some of these countries to build their own infrastructure, they give them some money, loan, good or bad, or Confucius institutions, of course, in some of these countries as a soft power of China, they do some, I guess, publicity in this regard. So the public perception of China in some of these countries are not as bad as others. So it quite varies. And but I would say Chinese authorities themselves, they know that they need to work on their own soft power and public perception with respect to their own foreign policy.
Okay. So is it very important, this public opinion, or not really at the end?
Definitely, it's important.
Does it have like an impact?
Yeah, of course, if especially in democracies, if states are relies on public policy, public perception, of course, public perception of any country is really, that's part and parcel of soft power, right? But if a state do not care about public perception, maybe this is not so crucial, but it's still a state has difficulties to convince the public to have a good relation. So it's always soft power matters. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much. I think I'm done personally with my questions.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for answering them. It was very interesting.
Thank you very much.
I hope we're going to get to discuss some other chapters or books you wrote.
Thank you very much. Good luck with your work. Thank you.
Have a good day.
Thank you.